All right, so it's Friday. We have a lot of people missing because, well, some people missing because of forensics and stuff. I'm recording today. It'll be up on Plus Portals. Will you let them know if you see them or talk to them that it'll be up on Plus? The first thing I talk about, no, will you get the door real quick? I graded 10 of the DBQs last night, which doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, it's more than you would think. It's about 2.5 hours of grading, something like that. And I want to talk about common things that I saw that I think I'm going to continue seeing that are easy cleanups for future stuff. So I'm not saying everyone did this. I only have a small sampling. They actually are from 4th hour. We all know they're way worse than you guys are already.
Did you say that? Did you say that to them too? Just about everyone.
No, of course not. I would never say something like that. Here's one thing. This is I think I'm partially to blame for this, and I'm taking responsibility. But we cannot make this mistake. I can't tell you how many times I saw Teddy Roosevelt passed blank. Woodrow Wilson passed blank. Taft.
If you say
whatever.
If you say Woodrow Wilson earlier and then later in the paragraph you say just Wilson, would that be okay?
Oh, that's not what I'm. So hold on. That's not what I'm nitpicking. If you say Woodrow Wilson and then you say Wilson, yeah, you're fine. If you even just say the last name, you're still good enough. It would be great in the opening paragraph to say Woodrow Wilson or their first name, but I mean, you could just say last name and you're not hammered like with deductions for it. No, not at all. The big thing is presidents don't pass laws. They urge for Congress to pass. They urge Congress to pass laws. They can advocate for. They can introduce bills to Congress, but they cannot themselves pass laws. There are so many times in U.S. history that a president wants so badly to accomplish some legislative agenda, and they just can't do it because they don't have support in Congress. The most recent thing we've talked about in this class would be John F. Kennedy. But he didn't have the support initially in Congress to do so, and so it kind of got put off on the back burner. Yeah.
What, like after his death, what boosted it? What boosted Congress's support of it?
So what happened is, and I'm gonna can I read you a little quote that I think is really fitting, and this we'll talk about this today. I probably should save it for later, but so after John F. Kennedy dies, soon thereafter, within weeks, Lyndon B. Johnson goes to Congress, and he makes a speech in front of Congress, and he says this: no memorial oration, like no memorial speech, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of a civil rights bill for which he fought so long. He goes before, and this, by the way, LBJ is a guy who's from Texas. He's a conservative politician. He probably wasn't nearly as on board with civil rights legislation as Kennedy would have been. But to his credit, he goes before Congress and said, this is how we should honor the president. And it becomes Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is major legislation as far as the civil rights movement goes. So do we got that so far?
Do you think if JFK wasn't assassinated, there would have been the same?
It's hard to tell. That's a big what if. If JFK wouldn't have been assassinated, what would be the outlook for civil rights legislation? Probably would have still passed because of how the events were unfolding during that time period anyways. There was more and more widespread support as people are watching all of this terrible violence break out across the country. But I don't know. That's a great question. It's a great what if. Now, that's the first thing. Congress passes laws. Presidents can urge Congress to pass laws. But please don't mix that up, because so many people said like Roosevelt himself was responsible for change. That's issue number one. Any questions on that at all? Okay. Issue number two. This seems like a subtle one, but it can make a big difference. Yeah, Katie, go ahead.
Wait, so you said like this law was passed under, like, was passed by Congress under, like,
under Roosevelt's administration, or another good way to say it is Congress passed this law, and President Roosevelt signed it into law, or passed a bill. And so technically when Congress passes a bill, it's not a law yet. It has to be signed by the president. That's when he signs it into law. So a good way to say it is Congress passed reform, President Roosevelt signed it into law, enacting change or reforms for the food industry, if we're talking about the Pure Food and Drug Act. You could say President Roosevelt urged Congress to enact reforms, and they responded by with the passage of the Hepburn Act, which regulated railroads. That's a way to say it. And Congress passed, because technically they're both needed for a bill to become a law. So you could just say simply, Roosevelt and Congress passed reforms, and then you're still good there. Does that make sense? Are fine. Any other questions? Federalism, state and local governments. Out of the I've read so far, which constitutes just under a quarter, so I've graded about 20%, over 20% of your DBQs. On the national level. You're telling me things the federal government did, and I understand. I get it. That's where most of the documents came from. You have to know, yeah. What's the prompt say? Let's read it. Good question. Evaluate the effectiveness of the progressive era reformers and the federal government. So evaluate the effectiveness of progressive era reformers and the federal government in bringing about reform at the national level in your answer. So, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. This point still holds true. The national level reform, you guys did a pretty good job with. But don't forget to recognize reformers on the state and local levels that are advocating or building up to national level change. Does that make sense? So, for instance, you could talk about the guy from Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, right, who is a huge proponent of progressive reforms. Talking about Jane Addams and talking about how on a local level she's enacting reforms, or on a local level she's opening settlement homes. She's opening and helping immigrant populations. On the local level, talking about political machines. This helps build context. So while you still need to have the focus on the national, don't forget to add this, and this adds depth to your argument. Yeah?
Oh, and you could also add depth by using state and local governments resistance
yes.
to the national reform.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you could talk about certain state and local governments that resist or that are upset or not on board with some of these progressive reforms. And that adds depth to it as well. But yeah, so the national level is the basis of the prompt. But don't forget that these other two, and this prompt is one, but this will be the case on pretty much anything you're talking about. Civil rights, if you had a DBQ on civil rights, don't forget it happens at different levels. If you have one on, expansion of slavery, you do it on this. If you're doing one on war and how the war affected the Vietnam War or even World War II or World War I, you could talk about how different levels, the ability to zoom in and out is a very valuable one. You don't have to do it. If you know nothing about the local level, stick to the one you know better, but it doesn't hurt to mention something about the others. One last thing, the last little piece, and this is an important one too. Contextualization. Contextualization. So many of you were using evidence. You talk about Square Deal, New Nationalism, New Freedom. You use the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was given to you. But putting it into context is also important. I can't tell you how many people told me about Roosevelt's presidency. And the documents, by the way, set you up to be tricked by this. Tricky. Teddy Roosevelt, when was he president from?
1900 to
1908.
1909 is when he leaves at the beginning of 1909. I can't tell you how many people talked about new nationalism and his ability to pass it forward. What's his legislative platform, political platform he runs on? This is the Square Deal. Square Deal. No, listen, hold on. I'm going to talk about this. The square deal was the 3 C's: conserve, natural resources, consumer protection, and control corporations. Do you remember this? And a lot of people told me about that, which was great. When Teddy Roosevelt reruns for president 4 years after this, because Taft comes next. Taft is from 1909 to 1913. And the election of 1912 is when Roosevelt's so upset with how Taft is managing the progressive movement and progressive reforms that you have Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson all run together. He runs as the Bull Moose candidate for the progressive, it's actually the Progressive Party. He runs as a Republican. He's considered the old guard or conservative Republican. And he runs as the Democrat. Woodrow Wilson does. This is when Teddy Roosevelt comes up with his new nationalism platform, the one that has a document from there. This is his, do you remember his? New Freedom. And that's when he's running. And I can't tell you how many people told me in the first 10, I think it's like 4 or 5 at least, told me that Teddy Roosevelt was president when the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed. But that's tricky because you read the Roosevelt quote, the document, that's Roosevelt's, and it's from 1912, I think is when it is. And then you see the Clayton Antitrust Act, and it's from 1913, and people just made that. It's not like the death knell of your essay. It's not like you're done and over with if you do that. But do you see how knowing that Teddy Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1909 can really help move your essay along, knowing Wilson is the last of the progressive era reformers, and talking about New Freedom and his banking overhaul with the Federal Reserve Act, and Congress passing the Federal Reserve Act, plus the Clayton Antitrust Act, and there was a tariff income tax. Yeah?
What year was the 18th Amendment passed?
So the amendment is prohibition. The 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. Are you asking about the
Senate one.
Oh, that's the 17th Amendment, and that happens, I believe. I don't know off the top of my head. Should we look it up? I got it. It's right here. Oh, it's freaking out. 17th. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know that for a fact. I just don't know under which president. Ratified. Are you kidding me? Come on. 1913. So, I mean, but if you don't nail it to the right president, that's fine. But just even talking about it would be great. Some of you did really well. If you can't remember the amendment numbers, still tell me that there was an amendment passed for this. And then I know the women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment, is going to be in 1920. So it's at the very tail end of that. And a lot of people told me women didn't have any gains in the progressive era. You can't say that's one of those ones where you've backed yourself into a corner. If I can find a single gain, you're now wrong. So you say women didn't have as many gains as they would like. That's a more accurate statement because the 19th Amendment was passed. Now, this prompt, nowhere in this prompt did it say analyze the election of 1912's role in all this. But if you could do that and say, the election, this progressive reform and what direction the progressive movement was going in impacted national elections and split the Republican Party, that's really good analysis, and that's where you're going to get some of the higher essays. But if you can't do it, I understand. Any questions on this at all? Yeah, Alex.
Say you didn't know what the name of the square deal, but you described the 3 C's. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't know the name, it's a square deal. You just say Roosevelt advocated for, consumer protection, controlling corporations, and conservation of natural resources. You're still talking about it. The way you get even better is you say Roosevelt control corporations in regulate the railroad industry. And you talk about the railroad industry saw some of its first regulations implemented under Teddy Roosevelt. If you're really nailing the passed the Hepburn Act, which regulated, workers' hours or regulated the rebates, cut into the rebates that some railroad industries were giving to certain companies. Yeah.
When was Carnegie Steel broken up?
That is under Taft. Yep, and Standard Oil also was under Taft. And so then you get that. But guess what? Like, if you don't know which president things happen under, that's tough. I mean, that's a tough. If you can, great. But if you can't, still talk about it. Just say other, other reforms during the era. Include. Any other questions? This is good stuff, though. This is good to clear up. Yeah, Alyssa.
Could you split this into a social, political, and economic one?
Yeah, and you could. And that's one way to earn the synthesis point, is to say, what economic reforms were there? And then talk about all three presidents and say, well, really, Woodrow Wilson led the way in economic reforms with his Federal Reserve Act. And you have a whole paragraph on economic reforms in the Progressive Era. And then you do social reforms. And you talk about maybe a lack of social reforms. While you had some gains in regulating, dangerous working conditions, others were not as successful. And then you do political, and you talk about regulating lobbyists and trusts and their influence on politics. And yeah, you could absolutely do that, yeah.
Did you talk about segregation?
Yeah, that's a great thing to talk about. Woodrow Wilson actually segregated the federal government's employees. I mean, he took a step backwards for them. And that's something that talks about a limitation. That's a perfect example of a limitation. You take that last document and you tie it to Woodrow Wilson and him and his segregationist and semi-racist views. That's absolutely a limitation, yeah.
So if you did that, then could you also tie that into how in the 1920s the KKK rose again? And
absolutely. That would be, then you start talking about, outside evidence and information, and even extending into time periods. There's going to be a wave of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-African American, and we see this with the growing number and growing membership in the KKK. And the first Red Scare happens during this time period as well. And so you could talk about, for immigrants, life didn't always get a lot better. That's a big one. That's one that we haven't talked a ton about, but for immigrants in the Progressive Era, they struggled. And sometimes they found the places they found the most help from wasn't from the national government. Heck, in the late 1920s, we implemented quotas so that we regulated who could come here. They found they're going to find most of their help from local governments and political machines that are helping them on a local level, cleaning up neighborhoods, building parks, things like that. Martin.
I guess this is kind of more like if this were to be an LEQ. So
Yeah.
Like if this same prompt, like generally and less specifically about like all three presidents, or would it be better just to like mention, like say Roosevelt and Taft, and then be really specific on Wilson? Like which would get you more points?
Ask the second part of your question again. So you get this, which would be better, A or B again?
Like being more general, like less specific, but talking like more about all of like the presidents, or talking a little bit about Roosevelt and Taft, and then being really specific on like Wilson.
Prompt, presidents, and it's Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But is it better to just do one big box and talk about all the reforms and the presidents generally, or talk about lump these two together and then talk about Wilson?
Know more like about Wilson. Should you?
I think you got to make that judgment call. So if you know about Wilson and you could tie specific things to Wilson, please make sure you let them know that these reforms happened under Wilson, and then you're being very specific where you can be, and then you can lump together Roosevelt and Taft in one paragraph and say two of the early progressive presidents were Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, and then you talk about all the legislation passed under them. You don't have to tie it specifically back to them if you're confused on who it is, but then you get more specific with where you are. Always be specific where you can be. And don't think that, well, since I can't be specific on the other two, I have to be vague for everyone. No, that's not the case at all. Not the case at all. Yeah?
So did you have to mention all the presidents in this one?
You didn't have to, but it certainly helps you to. How can you, that would be like saying, like, yeah, listen, America saw some dramatic changes in the first 2 decades of the 2000s. The Affordable Care Act was passed, and major health reforms were implemented in the United States, but not talking about President Obama and not mentioning Obamacare. So you could do it, but, and then, you know what's worse is not knowing and then just guessing. So let me give you an example, and this sounds ridiculous, but I had one person write an entire essay on FDR for the DBQ. You can't do that. That's New Deal stuff. I mean, you're wrong, huh? Yeah, for this one. They wrote about FDR. But the thing is, they talked about the 3 C's, and they talked about trust busting, and they talked about the Clayton Antitrust Act, and it was all they were talking about a person that was in the 1930s. I mean, and they did. And so I think that, you know what, it didn't completely tank their essay, but man, oh man, it didn't help. If they would have just said Roosevelt, they'd have been better off. If I was writing an essay about the Affordable Care Act and then said, and a smiling President George W. Bush signed it into law.
One, he doesn't sign it into law. Or doesn't.
Yeah, he would have.
He doesn't pass. Okay.
It's okay. That's why we're clearing this up. People laugh at you. Like, George W. Bush, he's not signing the Affordable Care Act into law. I'll tell you that. And so it's important. But, you know, knowing about what happened is equally as important. So don't not talk about something because you don't know who to associate it with.
Okay.
All right. Can we move on? One more question. This one.
So like, just say if you knew the time frame of like Roosevelt doing stuff, but you didn't know, say when the Clayton Antitrust Act or when senators, you could just say his predecessors.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you could say later in the era or during this time period from 1920 to 1900 to 1920. Yeah, be as specifically vague as you can be. Yeah.
Are we giving the short answers separately from the essays?
Yes. I don't know if you have to turn that packet in. I don't know if it'll be all contained in one booklet, but you're not supposed to go back. Does that make sense? Yeah. And the short answers will be before the DBQ and before the LEQ. One last thing. This rubric, this new one, is a 7-point rubric, 7 points. A full point, 1 point, 0 or 1, comes from synthesis. Did you divide it into 3 categories? Or did you connect it to another time period? We cannot afford to lose that point. Do we understand this? You cannot afford to lose that point. Now, you're not going to get that point by saying, thanks to the progressive reformers of the early 1900s, we became the great nation that we are today. Like that's not getting you your point. I can tell you that. But if you even say something like one of the limitations of the progressive era was the gains made for African Americans. Gains they would be without until the civil rights movement almost a half century later. I mean, that right there gets you your synthesis point. It's as easy as that. Or saying like women didn't gain full equality in society, right? Women would later have to fight in the 1960s and 70s in a feminist movement to gain these rights. And they're still fighting for equality in the workplace today. That gets you your synthesis point. Even if you're saying, I'm trying to think of other ways to do it, but please, 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 if you don't have it anywhere, just in your conclusion, connect it to... Some people said Plessy versus Ferguson, right? They started talking about limitations for African Americans and said they've been struggling with these segregation laws since after the Civil War and with cases like Plessy versus Ferguson. Yeah.
So you could do like the regulation of the railroads later played to them in the 1970s, which led to deregulation in the 1980s.
Perfect. That's perfect. You get your railroad fact-finding mission in there. Yeah.
So could you backtrack and get synthesis by talking about how the progressive movement fulfilled some of the populist ideals?
Yeah, populist. That's another one. You could talk about how the progressive movement grew out of earlier populist the earlier populist movement, and that's just like, you guys, if a 7-point scale is what we're working on, do you see how valuable 1 point is? It's big time. Yeah, and it's crazy to me. It's crazy to me. 2 of your 7 points comes from having a thesis and having synthesis. So you have to have a thesis that does more than restates the question. You cannot just say there were limitations and there were gains made. You can't just say that. Tell me, there were gains made in regulating businesses. That moves beyond. There were limitations in the gains made for African Americans. That's it. You get your point. It's like magically appears. It's the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. Please don't leave that. Don't reach for the top of the tree and leave the two fruit that are like screaming at you to get. Yeah.
So if in your essay you connected the, how can I word this? Like how African Americans didn't really gain anything from the progressive era movement, and you connected that to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and then...
You're still good. That would be fine too.
That would give you a synthesis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't tell you exactly for every circumstance and situation. Tom, you listening? I can't tell you, but you got to try. I mean, I had 3 essays out of the first 10 that got in such a hurry they didn't say anything synthesis-wise. They just got so caught up in it. Even if you're scrambling in the last 30 seconds, please tell me something about another era that you can connect back to this era or something. You could even talk about things going on outside the country. You know, like as the progressive era is unfolding in the United States, tensions in Europe are unfolding that are going to lead to World War I. That's synthesis. Talking about an outside of the United States development. That gets you synthesis, yeah.
Like the French Revolution.
But not during the progressive era. You're 100 years off. All right. We were doing civil rights yesterday, yes?
Yes.
Did we do, so my question is, did we get to the Birmingham, protests in Birmingham? So this is Birmingham. Birmingham. I would like to show you a few minutes clips of the Birmingham protests. Birmingham protests in March. We talked about the violence. Police Commissioner Bull Connor. I think his first name's actually Eugene. We'd have to look it up, but Connor. I think it's Conner, maybe O-R. Connor. I think it's O-R. Can we look it up real quick? It'll take 2 seconds. Eugene. Connor. Yeah, Bull Connor. It's a mean-looking man. And this is the cattle prods, fire hoses, and attack dogs that are unleashed on protesters, young protesters. Keep in mind, too, and I don't think I did a great job the other day talking about this. Yes, these protests, these marches, the Freedom Riders, the sit-in protesters, they are organized by African Americans in the African American community. But there are whites and blacks that are participating in these protests. Do you know this? So the Freedom Riders were, I think I did say, interracial groups. Yes. So keep that in mind. That, yes, organizations like the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're organizing a lot of these, the NAACP, organizing a lot of these protests and movement and parts of this movement. But there is a lot of involvement from people across the country. So Birmingham protests, and then we did the JFK speech plus Medgar Evers, who is shot and killed the same night. He's a civil rights activist who's shot and killed. Then in August is the March on Washington. MLK Jr. leads March on Washington. Which culminates in his I Have a Dream speech. If you haven't listened to that, it's a great speech to listen to. I have a dream. The first part of it, by the way, is he starts slow. And this is kind of a characteristic of several of Martin Luther King Jr. speeches. He starts a little slow, and then he builds and ramps up. And he was a phenomenal orator. What is it?
His real name is Theophilus Eugene Connor.
No wonder you went by Bull Connor. Okay, so I have a dream speech, and then in September 1963, tragic event. September 1963 is a bomb of Birmingham Church. It's a Baptist church in Birmingham. And 4 people were killed. 4 little girls, all under the age of 15. They were just finishing up their Sunday school lesson. The lesson was entitled "A Love That Forgives." And this bomb explodes. They were changing into their choir robes, and 4 young girls were killed. This is an act of terrorism. I mean, it's. Sorry, I don't know why it's searching. It's nothing more than an act of terrorism. And these girls were not participating in, the Birmingham marches and protests. They were not on the forefront of the sit-ins or the freedom. I mean, these are just girls going to church. And this is covered in the news. Much like the Boston Marathon bombings. You remember how much news coverage that. I mean, it's a bomb that goes off in a church with unsuspecting people. It is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And it really brings some of the worst of the violence to the forefront of the nation. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that that was real. That was in someone.
Yeah. Yep. That's absolutely real. And I don't know if you've. I don't. We're kind of running out of time. But if you ever heard of Condoleezza Rice, one of her best friends was one of the girls. She attended that church in Birmingham. One of her best friends was killed in the bombing. In November of 1963 is Kennedy's assassination. Kennedy's assassination. We know about this. So really, this marks a really critical point of the civil rights movement. LBJ goes before Congress, and he says, now is the time to act. No eulogy or memorial speech could do more justice than to pass this civil rights legislation. Keep in mind, 1964 is also an election year. So 1 year after Kennedy's assassinated, LBJ has to get reelected. That probably weighed a little bit on his mind in promoting and seeing through the civil rights legislation. Did I show you guys the LBJ ad with the girl picking daisies? 10, 9, 8. Yeah. That's the 1964 election. He runs against a guy named Barry Goldwater in that election. Have you guys ever heard of Barry Goldwater?
I read about it.
One thing that's important, if you allow me to go off on a quick side tangent, Barry Goldwater is considered the rise. He is the guy who embodies the modern day conservative Republican. Small government, wanted to do away with some of the reforms that Congress was passing as far as aid to education, as far as the social welfare programs like Social Security. He attacked the expansion of Social Security payments. He is a very much so conservative like you would see today. He only winds up winning. He was against the civil rights movement, by the way. He wins the deep southern states in his home state. And he loses in a landslide, absolute landslide. But he is the model for the modern day conservative party. And that's one of those LEQ, I hope not a DBQ, but could be one of those type of questions of how did political parties evolve and change over the 20th century. And you need to know that really starting in FDR's presidency with the New Deal, many African Americans abandoned the Republican Party, which had always been the party of Lincoln and the party that African Americans, those who were voting for. And they start making the shift to the Democratic Party. You should know today that minorities in general vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party or for Democratic candidates. And as that happens, you see a slow shift of white Southerners abandoning the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party used to be the bastion of the South and racism, and you start seeing a shift away from that. And by the 1948 is when you get the Dixiecrats. That's another term that you gotta look up and know. And throughout the 1950s, you start seeing more and more Southerners voting along Republican lines. And by the 1960s, you see even more of that change. And today, you should know, if you look at political maps and presidential campaigns, the South is all what color? Red. I mean, it is. Goldwater, last side note, I got to tell you this, because he what? What?
Alyssa's like, that guy's got to be Jewish.
Oh. Barry Goldwater is campaign that sticker that he would throw on everything was this.
Oh my god.
So anyways,
That's what I'm going to write in the AP test, Goldwater.
just that's you're not going to write it all out. You'll just do that as his acronym. It's like FDR and AUH2O. All right. So anyways, 1964. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Star it, underline it, highlight it. You must. There are three major things that you need to know and associate with this act. Number one is it bans segregation in most public facilities. Public facilities. Brown versus Board? Schools. Schools. Yep.
Then why was Ole Miss allowed to, James Meredith, why were they allowed to reject him twice?
They didn't. So that it was illegal, considered illegal. So this is a great question. It's something I wanted to touch on. Noah's question is, if Brown versus Board banned segregation in public schools, why then do you have the resistance at Little Rock? Why do you have the resistance at Ole Miss with James Meredith? This is a classic example of a law that is the difference between a law with a smiley face and a law that looks like this. What am I drawing here? Teeth. Sharp teeth. This law looks a little scarier than a law that's just got a big smiley face. And I know that seems very corny, but this is the difference between a law that can be enforced. I stick my hand in this law and I try and crumple it up, my fingers are getting bitten off. If I stick my hand in this law, well, nothing really happens. I get a nice gummy, I don't know, dentureless grandma feel.
Civil rights is the gummy, dentureless grandma.
So, no, this is what I'm saying is that this is the first Civil Rights Act with teeth. It's not to say that other previous civil rights legislation didn't have any teeth, but it's like a baby tooth or two versus actual teeth. And this is important. You could look at laws. So, I mean, think about it. This is crazy. The 15th Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the right to vote to African Americans. I mean, they should already have this right. Yet in 1960, almost 100 years later, there are like some 1% of people in Selma, Alabama that are registered to vote who should be eligible to vote. And they represent 50% of the population, the eligible voters there. So you just have a situation where the law didn't have enough teeth to really, or even an amendment, to really be enforced. And that is crucial. It would be like in the United States if the law to drink was 21, but no one ever stopped anyone for carrying, like if Tevens is carrying 2 cases down the road and a police officer ever stops him, well then you're less likely to follow the law. And if published on it, well, that all of a sudden makes it harder to enforce. And so you got to have measures in place for enforcing things. That's a key component of laws being followed. Yeah.
Did James Meredith go to local court first? So is that just like a corrupt court?
Yeah. So it's the same thing that's happening in the Supreme Court today. So you guys have all heard of the Supreme Court just heard oral arguments about the gay and lesbian couples the other day. Those two ladies, they're two nurses. They're foster parents. They take in kids with special needs. They wanted to have joint custody of their adopted children, so that if something happened to one of them, the kids wouldn't go back into foster care. Does that make sense? Yeah. And they went before the Michigan State Supreme Court, and they said, we want this law changed. And the Michigan State Supreme Court said no. So then they appealed to the federal district court in Ohio, and they said, we would like this law changed. Here's our argument. The federal court in Ohio said, no, we're not changing it. They appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court took the case. Yeah?
I thought that the Michigan Supreme Court actually gave them the yes, but then the prosecution
you're right.
went to the,
Stevens is right. So they got the okay from the Michigan Supreme Court, which is why you had that window where like 100 families got married. But then the governor put a squash on that until the federal court ruled. Yeah, you're definitely right. And then the federal court said no, and then the Supreme Court took it, and then they're going to decide in June. And if the Supreme Court makes this, if the Supreme Court says no, these ladies deserve to have the right to be married and a marriage license, that's going to be binding for the whole country. Guess what? I guarantee Texas is going to delay those types of things. Conservative states will, but I bet California will be the first state to. They already are, but it's already legal there. But my point is more liberal states will be more likely to jump on the bandwagon and be like, well, let's do it. And more conservative states will be more likely to resist. It's the same thing with civil rights legislation in the 1960s and 1950s. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the board, a lot of schools did integrate. Deep Southern schools didn't. And they're not going to until you have showdowns in which the President of the United States says, no, I'm sending in the 101st Airborne Division, and you will allow these students to go to school, or I will remove and take over your state of Arkansas, and Orville Faubus, you will be out of a job. Okay, so three things, and we got to get through these three things. Ban segregation in most public facilities. Two is it creates the EEO. This stands for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This bans or outlaws businesses from being able to not hire someone based on their race. It outlaws discrimination in hiring practices. If someone is denied a job and they feel it's solely because of their race, they can file a claim with the federal government. This organization, this government agency would investigate, and they could fine, they could punish, they could close down that specific business. I don't know all of their capabilities, but they could take action against that business. Does that make sense? The last thing it does, it also strengthened the government's power. It strengthened the government's power to end segregation in schools. This is providing teeth to the Brown versus Board. So I'm going to write teeth to Brown v. Board, meaning it increases the government's ability to end segregation in schools. I don't know exactly the mechanism for that, but just know it strengthens the government's ability to enforce desegregation in schools. Any questions on that? And then, 1965. There's still some issues left unresolved. The first is the passage of the 24th Amendment to the United States. The passage of the 24th Amendment to the United States, which abolishes poll taxes.
So these are unresolved? These resolved.
They're resolving this issue, poll taxes, amendment. This is poll taxes no longer. Poll taxes are banned. And the last, one of the most important, these three, the Civil Rights, the 24th Amendment, and this one, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, are huge, monumental. Voting Rights Act 1965. Let me tell you what this does. This outlaws literacy tests. Outlaws literacy tests. It also sends federal employees, federal registrars, to go and register people in the South to vote. It sends federal employees to the South to register black voters in places that increasingly had been denying the right to vote to African Americans. This is big. Martin Luther King Jr. once says at one point, you give blacks the right to vote and the possibilities are endless. Because the right to vote and actually securing the right to vote means that you can enact change and elect people who can. Last point I'll make today. I have 2 more points to make today. And they're both crucial to understanding this. Highly crucial. These are milestones. Milestones in the civil rights movement. Do you agree? Do you see why? That does not mean that everything is great for African Americans. That should make sense. Just because a place has to allow black customers doesn't mean walking into that diner and sitting down, that experience gets any better for you. Does that make sense? This is not the end of the civil rights movement. In fact, 1965 marks a turning point, and this is my second point. 1965 onward, you have increasingly an abandoning of nonviolent protesting and an increasingly bigger embrace of violent protests and this Black Power movement and people like Stokely Carmichael who are advocating for change by any means necessary. We're going to talk more about this on Monday, but I want you to know that 1965 onward marks a turning point. There's increasing riots, there are increasing violence and tension between blacks and whites, and this is something that Martin Luther King Jr. is going to struggle with, very much so going to struggle with. And we have these new young leaders that emerge, people like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, and are going to be arguing a different stance. Any questions on that at all? I promise you will have something to do with something I've written on the board on the AP test. It will be there. It can't not be. The very last thing I'll say, and it's not necessarily a point, this is considered part of LBJ's, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. So that's what I'll stop. See you guys.